the pretext of the meeting was, hey, we have information, and there was, some small talk that just was sort of nonsensical, inane and garbled, and then quickly went on to, a story about Russian adoption and how we could possibly help, and really that's where we shut it down.
My son is a wonderful young man. He took a meeting with a Russian lawyer. Most people would have taken that meeting. It's called opposition research. The press made a very big deal over something that really a lot of people would do.
To refresh memories, the meeting, June 9, 2016, Trump Tower in New York, blocks from here. It involved Donald Trump Jr., DJ TJ, Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and several Russians, including a lawyer linked to the Kremlin. The president's eldest son took that meeting at the height of the campaign after he was promised it would yield damaging information about Hillary Clinton, and it's thought to be a key part of the Mueller investigation. We have new insights into what went on at the June 9 meeting and what Don Jr. said from GQ correspondent Julia Yaffe, who is the co-author of a piece out tomorrow called Junior, the real story of Donald Trump Jr. Yaffe reports this detail about the Trump Tower meeting. Quote, according to a person who was there after some pleasantries about the view of Central Park, Don got straight to it. So I believe you have some information for us, he asked. Yaffe goes on to say that the Russian lawyer brought up several other topics, but not Hillary Clinton. So can you show us how does this money go to Hillary? Two of the participants recall him asking. According to one of the participants in the meeting, Don began to realize he wasn't going to be handed what he was hoping for. The light just went out in his eyes, the participant told me recently. He was totally disinterested. Well, here to talk about all of it, the aforementioned Julia Yaffe, a veteran journalist who has just become a correspondent with GQ, Michael Crowley, national security editor and senior foreign affairs correspondent for Politico, and our friend and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance remains patiently with us from Washington. Julia, for members of the audience who don't know your life or CV, perhaps I will reduce you to one sentence when I remind everyone. Born in Moscow, which these days is all the rage, moved here at age 7, went to Princeton, Fulbright scholar, and most of your adult life has been as a journalist and author. So you tackle this topic as your first new piece in GQ. What you've learned about Don Jr., the meeting, Trump Tower? What does it say about the Trump effort overall to you?
I think of what I gathered from it was I think Donald Trump Jr. was trying to be as helpful as he could to his father, to have his father notice him, to kind of show some love and some pride in his son, which, from what I've heard from people who know him, is very hard for Don Jr. to get. So he took this meeting, among others, as we've since learned with the Saudis, Israelis. And he took this meeting trying to help his father. He kept trying to bring it back to Hillary, dirt on Hillary or Hillary Clinton in some way. And what's interesting to me is that one of the participants I talked to they came away feeling sorry for Donald Trump Jr. And one of the congressional investigators I talked to felt sorry for Donald Trump Jr. It's so interesting to me that this person who's such an angry, defiant kind of angry troll on the internet defending his father evokes such kind of condescending sympathy from people he encounters.
Michael, you come away from Julia's article realizing the way limited importance of the meeting was long ago eclipsed by the meeting's importance to one Robert Mueller.
Right.
If you get my drift.
Well, absolutely. And Don Jr. now finds himself, he may have been very disinterested when the meeting wasn't delivering the goods that he wanted, but now he finds himself under the Klieg lights. And, what I think is, what Julia just said is so interesting, this idea that he's an object of pity, that there's almost something pathetic about the fact that he was trying to help his father out here and it didn't work out the way he wanted. But I also want to focus on the fact that, in those sound bites he played earlier, they illustrated the way that people around Trump keep talking about this meeting in this very narrow sense. We sat down and we realized this Russian lawyer came with a bill of goods. It was bogus. They didn't have the goods. We were disinterested. We left because we had better things to do. My eyes glazed over. I didn't care. that is narrowing the lens too tightly. You have to zoom out and remember, what did the email say setting up this meeting? What is possibly, Brian, the most interesting line that has been recorded on paper or in pixels in this entire investigation? This is part of the Russian government's effort to help your father become elected president of the United States. This idea that Donald Trump says, well, it's opposition research, anyone would take it. I mean, come on, that is a jaw-dropping line. Any responsible citizen would call authorities or not take the meeting. So maybe there's pity for the guy in the moment, but I would say in the big picture, that is the key fact here. It's not exactly what happened in the room. It's the understanding that that's what was happening.
Julia?
I also think Michael is, as always, absolutely right. But I think that it's also interesting that even the people who were trying to help the Trump campaign with dirt ostensibly provided by the Russian government, even they, he was their kind of handoff point, and even they came away from this meeting as like, poor guy. Like when the Russians are trying to help you, they're trying to give you opposition research, and the people around Donald Trump Jr. are like, how did he not call the authorities?
Yeah.
Or, wow, he's really kind of pathetic.
And Joyce, just right there on that point and the point Michael made, remind us how unnormal it is. Like, you invited who to Trump Tower based on the predicate of what?
The first thing that should have happened when the offer for this meeting was made is that someone on the campaign staff should have picked up the phone and called the FBI. It's illegal to accept or solicit donations from a foreign country in connection with an election. And if Donald Trump Jr. didn't know that at this point, although he should have, Paul Manafort, an experienced campaigner, certainly was aware of it. So the most extraordinary feature of this meeting has always been the fact that no one called law enforcement, and that's made even more acute by the fact that the FBI had warned the campaign that they believed that they might be approached by Russians who were trying to interfere with the election. It's really a big picture piece for Mueller at the end of the day when he sees how the motivation for Donald Trump Jr., which we're learning about in this new piece of reporting, impacts the overall willingness of the campaign to engage with the Russians, which may well provide Mueller with a larger train of evidence proving intent or perhaps ultimately proving a conspiracy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.